Hello and welcome to the 2024 Election Watch podcast series. I'm your host, Matuba Mahlatjie, and today we have some incredible guests joining us on the 2024 Election Watch podcast series. This is a global LGBTQI plus inclusive democracy and empowerment initiative, or as we call it, is better known as GLIDE initiative, which is between Outright International Synergia Initiatives for Human Rights and the International Federation for Electoral Systems. This podcast series aims to comprehensively analyze key elections in 2024, specifically focusing on the political landscape implications for LGBTIQ people from a human rights perspective and how LGBTIQ communities are engaging in these political moments. To discuss the political landscape and implications for LGBTIQ people, I'm joined by Linda Baumann, who based in Namibia, as well as Chanel van der Linde, who's in South Africa. I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves shortly. And once again, my name is Matu. I'm your host for this election podcast series brought to you by Outright International, Synergia Initiative for Human Rights, and the International Federation for Electoral System. Linda, I'm going to start with you and ask you to please introduce yourself to our podcast listeners.
Thank you very much, Matumba, for having me. My name is Linda Baumann. I am from Namibia. I am a feminist human rights and communications activist. I am with an organization called Namibia Diverse Women's Association. It's an LGBTIQ-led feminist organization. I work broadly within the areas of human rights, gender, and inclusive development.
That's great. Thank you, Linda, for joining us. So you're really welcome. Chanel, let's hand it over to you to please introduce yourself.
Okay, hi. My name is Chanel van der Linde. I am a project officer at the Center for Human Rights based in the Faculty of Law in the University of Pretoria. We function both as an NGO as well as an academic institution and publish works on LGBTIQ plus rights across the continent of Africa, and also engage in advocacy and trainings for a large variety of folks in South Africa and the rest of Africa.
It sounds like you both do very important and interesting work, and I thank you both for joining this podcast, which I hope will reach out to as many people as possible, especially people who are going through, anti-human rights wave that we've been seeing around the continent. Maybe they can use this as a resource when elections come on in their countries. But I would like to start with the first question to both of you as some sort of reflections on the strength, the weaknesses and opportunities of the LGBTIQ movement in both your respective countries, that is Namibia and South Africa. And maybe also add on top of that how anxious or how positive you are about the upcoming elections in both your countries. I'll start with you, Linda, actually. Go first for me.
Thank you very much. I think there has been, when we swat the reality of the movement, and if I have to think about 10, 15 years to 20 years ago, where we find ourselves right now is extremely at a different wavelength of where we've been 10 years or 15 years ago. 10, 15 years ago, there was hardly an opportunity to be able to even meet any political leadership in your country or outside your country. That initially manifests how uncomfortable it has been for state agents or leadership to be engaging on the issue of sexual orientation and gender identity. The only opportunity that we had with them is to hold them accountable at the African Commission or the Universal Periodic Review processes. And that initially speaks about the hard work that manifested over the years in really advancing basic human rights as inclusive and inalienable for all persons. That initially also speaks about where we find ourselves now. We're able to see gradual growth in inclusive governance, and I can unpack that as we go through the program. On top of that, also, we must be able to manifest greater success because back in the days it was difficult to even have organizations operate in the different countries. But now, if you see, if I make an example for Namibia, if I think about our liberation struggle as a movement, we started in 1994. There was only one organization that existed, and then another one that existed in 2010. 2015 manifested the growth and birth of what today we would call as 19 organizations existing. That initially says that there has been an enabling environment created in our country for us to be able to operate, as much as there are greater challenges within manifesting the basic human rights and inclusion of all persons. I can also say there has been great reform development in our country when it comes to policy and legislative processes. That initially speaks to a strategic approach that we had to take as a movement to be able to build intersectionalities in different issues of human rights, like gender issues. We had to make sure that the manifestation of the gender representation, but also linking that to the Domestic Violence Act, to be able to see how same-sex persons can be protected. We have also seen the rise in the reality of anti-LGBTI groups, violence against LGBT people. We've also seen the enactment of legislations that are anti-LGBT within our country, but also broadly in our continent. What we can actually say that is a great challenge broadly, not just for Namibia, but it is broadly in the continent, that has to be with a systematic documentation of human rights violation has been a weakness that we've been having. And that has been an argument which our states use, that you can't prove the amount of hate crimes or violence perpetrated against queer folks. That initially speaks to the importance of how we had to build intersectionalities with other CSOs, other mainstream departments and developmental institutions in order to strengthen the agenda and where we are heading. That initially also links us to the importance of bringing LGBTI people to an extent of getting them to understand their civil and political rights in order for us to be able to advance a healthy and well-being of our community. So that aspect around building human rights defenders have amplified the importance of getting LGBTI people to participate in politics, but also the processes of democracy. And that is why today we are talking about elections and the importance of queer folks having to participate in elections. We know for a fact that a lot of the LGBTI people carry apathy when it comes to elections, because they are affirming that they are not recognized nor protected by any legislation in the country. But we also carry a responsibility as members of the LGBTI community to ensure that we are participating in the processes of democracy, but also making sure that we're able to influence legislative and policy reform processes.
Oh, thank you so much for the summary, Linda. We really appreciate that. And I heard a lot of positivity, and you really gave a good summary, because now we are also aware of the challenges which are not unique to Namibia, but to most parts of the continent. And Chanel, I would like to hear from you, but you can expand your scope because you work with other human rights lawyers around the continent. But so you could also add to give context and perspective around the work that you do, and have your reflections about the growth of the challenges, the growth and the opportunities of the LGBTQ movement in South Africa and maybe beyond our borders. Please go for it, Chanel.
Great, thank you so much. So it's quite interesting. I think when it comes to South Africa, I feel a lot more confident about the protection of LGBT persons in South Africa. The Constitution of South Africa, for example, enshrines the right to freedom from discrimination, and very advancedly, it actually speaks to the right of freedom from discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, which I think is not in many other constitutions in the world, if in any other constitution. So when it comes to South Africa, I feel quite positive about rights in South Africa remaining the same, and that LGBTQ+I persons can also get these rights and claim these rights within South Africa, despite what's going to happen with the elections, despite who's going to be coming in. I think that the constitution is still going to be the same. And I'm quite positive about that aspect of the elections in South Africa. Perhaps not so much about other areas that cause anxiety for many South Africans. I also think South Africans are very keen on litigation. We seem to love to litigate, especially civil societies. And that's how we were able to achieve a lot of positive protections for LGBT persons, as well as the implementations of things such as the Civil Union Act and the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act, is because civil society was very keen on litigating. Nowadays, however, I think that the South African LGBTQI plus movements or civil society groups are a bit more fragmented. There's more challenges in accessing funding, and that can increase the competition between groups. And I think we tend to also work in silos in South Africa, which is a bit of a challenge when it comes to civil society. And because of this, in the past decade or so, we haven't seen as many advancements in the rights of LGBTQI plus persons as our neighboring countries. But when it comes to Africa, however, I think that many of our perceptions shift. And I think that the anti-rights movement, as you mentioned earlier, is a lot more prevalent in other African countries. Of course, the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda is funded basically by the anti-rights movement. Now, the act in Ghana, the bill in Ghana, let's hope it does not become an act, that also criminalizes LGBT identities as well as allies, interestingly enough. That also has its roots in the anti-rights movement. And we're also seeing an increase in a shift towards not allowing the registration of LGBT NGOs, which cuts them off at their knees, really, because that then stops them from being able to get funding, stops their activities and their advocacy from taking place, never mind criminalizes what they're doing, which puts them at a risk of being jailed. So when it comes to Africa as a whole, we're seeing very disturbing trends that are coming out, and where we saw wins, such as, for example, in Kenya, it has been seen as also progressively moving towards the inclusion of LGBTIQ plus persons. For example, last year, there was a case that allowed the registration of a LGBT NGO. Now we are also seeing at the same time the anti-rights movement becoming stronger and these anti-homosexuality bills being proposed. Because as well as in Kenya, this bill is on the table there. And we're seeing it also now creep closer and closer to South Africa, which I think that a lot of South Africans are maybe not aware of, and maybe other countries as well in Southern Africa, is that if we start looking more carefully at the funding patterns and who's been involved in what project or in what event, we're starting to see the anti-rights movement names pop up in these kinds of spaces as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something to look out for, and I tend to think that sometimes we need to be more proactive and not wait for things to fall apart and create strategies already now. So how we push back to these growing patterns that you're talking about, Chanel, and I appreciate your insights in that regard. Linda, let's start with you. On going deeper into our specific countries, because Namibia has seen a shift in the political landscape recently with the death of President Hage Geingob, who, by the way, is seen as leaving a mixed legacy on LGBTIQ issues. I mean, he delayed the signing into law of the anti-same-sex marriage bill that was passed by an overwhelming majority of parliament. Where does this leave the movement, the LGBTIQ movement?
I think former President Hage Geingob did not leave a mixed message in his legacy. I think for me, as a human rights defender and activist in this country, when he was asked his first question upon taking up the office, he was very clear when he was asked, what's your stance on LGBT issues? His response was, do LGBTI people face the same challenges as the other community? Are they hungry? Do they need basic care? And if so, let's first deal with those realities. As much as it looks like a bypass of a response, he initially positioned himself to say, I'm here for all Namibians. He's also demonstrated in his legacy of being the president of 2 terms that he protects all Namibians, and that is why he has built the Namibian House, whereby he manifested before he passed on that this anti-same-sex marriage bill, that is a private bill by one of our parliamentarians, is not constitutional, and he's not going to entertain that. So he's always been a man who upheld the Constitution because he's one of the writers of our Constitution that initially says that all persons are protected and free from discrimination. So his legacy for me as an activist is very clear, that he's saying that I am not going to criminalize something I don't believe as justifying constitutionally. That initially says that where we find ourselves under Article 66 of the Namibian Constitution, that process of the Attorney General that still needs to engage the current president around whether this bill is constitutional or not, because that's the status quo that needs to come out in order for us to be able to know what the current president will be doing, even though I'm of the strong conviction that he's not going to entertain that. And that particular bill is also not on the bills to be discussed in Parliament. However, the very same parliamentarian who brought up this bill has recently been asking, where is that bill and why is it not moving? That could make it a bit dangerous, because when that bill came out after we as a movement successfully won litigation cases in the High Court. And those litigation cases, one had to do with surrogacy of a gay couple who gave birth to twins in South Africa and wanted to bring their kids back to Namibia, but could not access any state documents. And the second one, which of last year, that prompted this particular bill, was passed last year in the High Court, when in the Supreme Court, when the LGBTI persons who got married to foreign spouses were given equal rights in the country. And that illuminated greater anti-LGBTI groups religiously, politically, and that initially places us in a compromising position, because there's been an escalating increase around LGBT violations, hate crimes, and also murders. We just experienced a trans woman and a gay man being murdered about 2-3 weeks ago. And that initially speaks a lot around how there is greater homophobia and transphobia in this country that is being experienced. But also this is driven by very few groups of people who are initially trying to distort the current year of elections as a form of what they've always done every election year, to make us the scapegoat. So I think President Hage Geingob has left the current president with a great burden to challenge him around his personal positioning around the principles of human rights. And I doubt that bill will ever pass in Parliament, because if not, we are going to challenge it constitutionally in court and be able to see what is whether the Namibian Constitution is initially the supreme law of this country.
You know, this brings joy to my heart to hear you speak with so much confidence, and having confidence in the judiciary of a country in Africa, because the narrative is different out there about, the separations of power between the judiciary and the executive. And to hear an activist having so much faith in the judiciary, it really shows that we are really moving forward, as a continent. And I appreciate those insights, Linda. Chanel, let's continue the discussion now. And I'll tell you what I was working on last week that builds up to this question. I was in the middle of writing an article on South Africa's 3 biggest parties, and on how they included the LGBTIQ people in their election manifestos. And I saw the Economic Freedom Fighters, the 3rd biggest party, wrote a very impressive manifesto, from a party that just was birthed 10 years ago, which broke away from the governing African National Congress, and how they gave us a detailed plan on their inclusivity they will implement when they are in office, should they be voted in. When the official opposition party, which is the Democratic Alliance, on the other hand, had nothing at all on LGBTIQ issues in their manifesto, but they are known for supporting LGBTIQ human rights, even though we can go back to 2006 when the Civil Union Act bill was signed. They told their MPs to vote on their conscience. They didn't force anybody to vote for same-sex marriages. And I just wanted your assessment from you about whether these political parties in South Africa have capacity to deliver governance that will strengthen the movement. And I'm asking this question from different perspectives as a country that's plagued by corruption and high employment. I heard you in your first answer, they're talking about other things that give South Africans anxiety, which include this corruption and governance issues that we have. And we are also a very racially polarized country. So is there capacity to focus on LGBTQ issues and empower them while we have laws that support that, but do we have politicians who have capacity to do so in your own view?
Yeah, I think with Africans, when we are talking about anxieties that we have, for many of us, the first thing that comes up is the power crisis. I always say if you've met a South African in the past 20 years, that's the first thing we'll probably bring up. And as Linda also mentioned previously, there are so many considerations actually in politics. You got your primary and your secondary considerations. In human rights, we speak of your waves of rights. You get your first wave of rights, second, third, and the first wave is political and civil rights, and second wave is more economic, social rights, and third wave is more collective rights. But the whole idea sometimes is that how can we focus on a certain right if other rights are not met? For example, the right to vote. How can you have the right to vote if you don't even have food? How are you going to be alive to even vote? And there's so many things that we have to consider. But in answering your question, I think that the primary departure point is to keep in mind that politicians, majority of the time, have piecemeal approaches to minority rights. And at the end of the day, for them, it's about securing votes. The pink votes, which is a name that's given to the LGBTIQ plus voting bloc, has historically not really been capitalized on in South Africa. As you mentioned earlier as well, the DA said, vote on your conscience. And the statistics that have come out show that at least 1.4% of South Africans identify as LGBT. And this is over 500,000 South Africans, which equates to quite a large number of votes. And we're just here speaking about those who identify as LGBT, which means those that are comfortable with openly identifying with it and doesn't also include perhaps allies to the movement. And with politicians, they'll also attempt to win over the confidence of legislators and traditional leaders. And those are persons who can have a huge impact on their voting numbers. So to answer the question, when it comes to governance, I'd like to kind of split it into 3 sub-questions that I think anyone can ask themselves if they're thinking about voting for a political party and they're wondering if this party will end up strengthening the LGBT movement in South Africa. First of all, I think we need to ask, are LGBTIQ plus rights even mentioned in the manifesto, as they were historically not likely to be part of the party manifestos? Secondly, if they are in the manifestos, what is being said about them and to what detail are they being spoken about in terms of the implementation? And then third, I would say, what are the real life examples of the implementation of their manifesto? So do they put their money where their mouth is? And if you'll allow me, I'll make 2 points on this. So the first point is on the party list system. Well, the DA does not have a quota system. And as you mentioned earlier, if you just do even a quick search of their manifesto and you press Control F, you'll find they don't even mention LGBTIQ, homosexual, homophobia at all. But then their party practices in the past have shown that they have many LGBTIQ plus members that are out and open about being in the community. But then the ANC and the EFF both vouched to include a percentage of LGBTIQ plus persons in their party lists, which technically ensures that there will be LGBTIQ plus persons occupying a parliamentary seat. And from past research on women's representation, this approach has shown to significantly increase the number of women that are on party lists. So the quota for LGBT persons also shows that the parties are open to LGBT representation. But there's two issues that can arise, which is that first, the party lists themselves don't say who is LGBT and who isn't. It's just the first name and last name of the person. So this puts people then in the position that they need to come out themselves, and that can open them up to potential violence and consequences in their personal lives. And secondly, political parties actually can put LGBT persons at the bottom of the party list, which satisfies that obligation of the quota system, but it lowers the possibility of LGBT persons occupying parliamentary seats. So then this requires us to take a more careful look at who is on the party lists, and it speaks to the difficulty in actually ascertaining if the party has a vested interest, which is my second point. And that I think that any party has the capacity to deliver governance that would strengthen the LGBT movement in South Africa, whether it be through a quota system or having harsher sentences for hate crimes or changing education policies. There is a lot of financial and human resources available in South Africa. But the issue for me lies in political will. Because if a party is dedicated to truly improving the lives of LGBT persons, then they'll make this intention clear, and often that would be through providing roadmaps or detailed plans for the implementation. And the only party that has made that clear to me has been the EFF. Because within the manifesto, it not only mentions LGBTIQ plus persons, but it greatly expands on what they intend to achieve for the community and how they intend to achieve it. I think they have a whole separate section on LGBTIQ plus community. And this is in stark contrast then to the ANC manifesto, which very broadly speaks that they will aim to advance the rights and dignity of LGBTIQ plus persons, which they include in another category that includes like women, persons with disabilities, children, and other vulnerable groups. And that's like a very vague statement, and it doesn't really expand on how they are going to advance the rights and dignity of these persons. But then, whilst I just said that the EFF does include LGBTIQ plus persons, they expand on it quite greatly. Practically, there's a bit of contention because the EFF leader, Julius Malema, has voiced his support for the LGBT movement, but then its members, on the other hand, have shown homophobia and disregard for the community through things such as when they hosted an event at UCT and at University of Cape Town, and they invited a well-known homophobic speaker. And when multiple NGOs tried to discuss the issue with them, including LGBT persons on social media and private letters and communications, they dismissed the concerns. So at the end of the day, I think also governance is not a single issue, but it's rather a holistic thing. And we need to see all sectors of governance achieved rather than just one single sector.
Some great points you make there, Chanel, especially on the EFF. And you also touched on a lot of things that include political will. And I mean, we have South African President Cyril Ramaphosa sitting with the hate crimes bill that could actually literally save a lot of lives if it was signed into law at any time. But we're still waiting for that. Maybe it's one of the election tickets, who knows? But you also touched on something interesting, which puts me to a question back to Linda. You spoke about women leadership, Chanel, but in Namibia, there's interesting developments that are taking place. The Southwest Africa People's Organization, SWAPO, the presidential candidate will be Vice President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, who will be SWAPO's first woman presidential candidate. The optics tell us this is progress, but is she someone the LGBTIQ movement can count on, Linda, when in office? If not, is the leading contender Panduleni Itula, who of the Independent Patriots for Change Party, who made history and got 30% of the vote in 2019 election, which is the highest opposition result in a presidential election, the one to put in that office. I'm not trying to make you pit them against each other. This is not a personality contest or anything, but who is more likely to endorse progressive policies that ensure no one's left behind, Linda?
Well, I think Panduleni Hulaitana indeed was the first presidential opposition who has made that history, but I don't think right now that he carries that wave and cloud of being able to get the same results of being the second contender. Because there are other emerging candidates that are also vying for that particular positioning. At the same time, also with his party, I think for queer folks, they also had quite a high level of confidence in him bringing change. But after the elections, his party just went quiet because initially his party didn't have a seat to say anything in parliament. So because his party just came in for presidential candidacy and not National Assembly spacing. And also, in responding to your questions, let me first speak as a woman. I can tell you that is great progress. Namibia is the first African country who currently historically has 50-50 representation in parliament. That says a lot around it. But obviously, there's a deeper question about as much as it's 50-50, how many of the women are initially ministers themselves instead of being deputy ministers? Because it's also about where the power lies. So I celebrated that success. I celebrate the success of having the second female candidate in Africa, because Liberia's Serif was the first female president in our continent. I can actually say the current presidential candidate for SWAPO initially does not have a reputation of hate speech in this country generally. She's remained a diplomat and minister for international relations for quite some time. So her diplomacy and positioning has not come out publicly around what she feels and thinks. But we can actually also narrate that SWAPO as a political party has got elements of leaders. And I don't want to say that the whole political party as SWAPO is homophobic, because it's not. I believe that there are elements in the political party that are influencing and instigating homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and also extended to that, advances politically hate speech and hate crimes. So I can actually say we would need to see her performance during the election campaigning process, but also what her stance is around queer folks. She has been labeled as being progressive by some and promoting homosexuality on the basis that her designer, who designed her outfit during the late president's funeral, is a gay man from South Africa. So that label has been coming on her. But I cannot say she's somebody that is homophobic. The best thing would be, and the way I've been following her for years, is that she's always been a straight bat heater. So I can't really illuminate the fact that she could be retrogressive, but we also know in politics, we go where the votes are. So who knows where the votes are is where the majority of the positioning would be. So, and also that would initially be able to give us an idea. SWAPO until today does not have within its manifesto anything related to LGBTI people. But I can say there's one or two political parties like the All People's Party that I've personally engaged and trained, the Landless People's Party, because they wanted to start the conversation around queer folks in the past 2 years in order to see how they can improve their manifesto. So we are hoping to see all these manifestos making their presence around. But I can tell you right now, I agree with Chanel around how these manifestos are narrating our existence in it, but the reality living from it says the other way. And I want to amplify all her questions that she has placed around how political parties illuminate our existence or just illuminate us to get the vote. So we also carry the responsibility as a movement to ensure how we do civic education for our people, but also be able to guide them to know and how to read their manifestos in order to find the political party that speaks to their agenda and also discourse of need. So Namibia is currently in a very volatile position when it comes to queer folks and politics. We've not engaged as a movement directly in LGBT elections, but I can tell you individually with some of us that are politically active have tried doing inroads, and we are now trying to cultivate a greater strength of getting LGBTI people to start making themselves visible in the spaces, but also moving in such a way that their voices are heard. I can also share on the show that there are members of the LGBTI community that are considering starting an LGBTI political party. I don't know how far that is, but there's been quite a high level of promotion around that. And I think we need to encourage diversification of representation, but we are also saying we need to be careful of starting an LGBT political party and then just limiting it or getting it labeled to be a queer folks, but it should be an inclusive party that recognizes all persons irrespective of who they are.
Very interesting developments. Thank you, Linda. And I think something we should interrogate soon is the role that civil society organizations play in an election, period, because sometimes people's minds, hearts, and political beliefs can be changed based on where they get funding as well. But I'm sure that's a debate for another day. But I think we should make time to interrogate the civil organizations, societies, organizations.
Yes, I think it's important that we do that. That would be in relations to how do we prepare the LGBTI movement as civil society partners to be able to engage? Because there are other civil society organizations that are 10 steps ahead when it comes to really doing civic education, but also electoral education in the country. I think the essence here is what is our collective agenda as a movement that we would like to see, even though it's going to be uniquely tailored. But I think we need to discuss this and have a projected strategy that would be able to look at what is it that we are calling for, what's our call to action, but also what is our safety, safeguard, risk mitigation strategies. Because more than 20 countries to 56 countries in the world will be having elections in this year. That initially says to you that there's great volatility when it comes to queer folks in the different countries. And we need to be able to figure out how do we consolidate and centralize conversation that would be able to get us to understand how the interaction with political parties would be, taking a framework that would be able to be reflective on our rule of law and democracy, but also the process of elections in our different countries. But also, what does election mean for queer folks and their safety when they go to polling stations, especially for trans women too?
I totally agree with you. Thank you. I mean, out of this show, we already have another topic for the next show. So I'm very grateful that I have guests like you who help me brainstorm unintentionally. So, and thank you for your reflections on the vice president in Namibia. And I'm going to go straight to South Africa now, Chanel, where we have another personality in this election season, what some newspapers have called the silly season. And LGBTIQ people often feature in these campaigns for votes. And not so long ago, former South African President Jacob Zuma, who has since formed his own party and contesting elections, told people during one of his campaigns that he'd repeal laws that didn't enjoy the support of the majority of people in South Africa. He was questioning how laws are passed, arguing that they don't reflect the values of many citizens. And he cited the Civil Union Act as one of them, and uttering homophobic comments, of course, while telling that to his constituency 2 weeks ago. What is your reaction to his contention, especially how laws are passed and the involvement of people, and how do we even gauge that this resonates with majority of South Africans?
I love the idea of the CSO being interrogated as well, because I think that's really, really important. And CSOs are basically the frontline defenders, right? We're talking about our governments and the elections. But these NGOs can rise up and assist in the protection of LGBT persons. But yeah, so Jacob Zuma is really, he's become like a character, I think, in South African news. But really, I think it's super dangerous for any politician to be promoting homophobic rhetoric. If we examine it from like a legal perspective, it's highly unlikely Zuma would be able to overturn something such as the Civil Union Act, because the right to freedom from discrimination is enshrined within the Constitution. As I said before, Section 9 of the Constitution says you are free from discrimination, including on the grounds of sexual orientation. So really, I think legally, it does not have much weight. And I think if you examine the previous statements he's made before, a lot of the statements he has made doesn't really have any real legal backing to it, or the citation of various acts or legislations. So legally, I think we can kind of like dismiss it and just ignore it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we should discard the social impact that his words can have. So with Zuma, his greatest constituency is within KwaZulu-Natal, and that includes those in rural and peri-rural areas. And these communities very much still listen to traditional leaders and other leaderships that can influence how they vote. So at the same time, he holds a lot of sway with these traditional leaders that can subsequently affect how people vote and along what lines they vote. And the rhetoric that he gives, this anti-homosexual rhetoric, and I think it's just anti-LGBT, because probably if you probe further about like the rights of trans folks or non-binary folks, it's probably this kind of right-wing idea of being against those, I'm assuming, but just looking at the past. The rhetoric kind of provides a moral backing also for hate crimes to be committed. And in South Africa, we have one of the highest rates of sexual assault in the world. And when you combine it with the prevalence of violent crimes that take place against LGBT persons, then this correlates to the high number of corrective rapes that we see of lesbians in South Africa, which is always such a travesty to speak about, because it seems that every week news comes out about another lesbian who was raped. And when a politician makes comments such as this, it leaves quite a lasting impression, I think, in the psyche of those who do listen to him. And to the politician, it probably doesn't mean anything to them. It's an act of populism, and it's appealing to the masses in order to garner votes. And I think in his case, he doesn't not have a regard for the consequences of his words, especially in a country like South Africa that has such high levels of gender-based violence and corrective rape. But it's always such a difficult thing, I think, to speak about, because his words, he's kind of dismissed and made a joke of a lot. I think in South Africa, we can't deny that his words can affect how folks think and feel, and give them that moral authority to perpetuate crimes against LGBT persons.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chanel. And I tend to agree with you. And maybe some other time we should also interrogate how, South Africa has done so well in terms of, its policies and laws, but did very little to decolonize, or even, how can I put this? I think what South Africa didn't do so well is the social impact of the laws and policies that we have, because this is why people like Jacob Zuma can make comments like that, homosexuality is not something that's palatable to majority of the people in the country. But maybe we should look at how we are socializing our children these days, and so that we change this for people who come after us,
I think to say decolonize is very much the word, though, because that's another rhetoric. Here's another topic as well, but it's another rhetoric that homosexuality is not African, but it's very much African. It's very much in a lot of African rhetoric and storytelling and history, but it's really a colonial idea. The penal codes, the anti-homosexuality acts, those will come from colonial states. African states didn't penalize same-sex marriage or same-sex relationships.
So true, so true. Thank you for that. Because we are pressed for times, I'm going to ask, my final question, about something that you've both spoken so much about, the wave of anti-human rights interruptions we've seen put the lives of queer people in danger. Recently here in Ghana, with the passing of the anti-queer or the bill, and we know what's happening in Uganda, and it's happening in Malawi, and it's happening in many other countries that are underreported. And it's tough for our siblings on the African continent. But my question now is, are your countries immune to the interferences we have seen recently that actually influence legislation? And if so, what makes them immune? And if they are not immune, what makes them vulnerable? I'll start with you, Linda.
I think no country is ever immune from from being influenced. We are already influenced by default of the status of operations of and legislations that we've still adopted back in the days that is still currently functional and so forth. We've also seen the influx of anti-rhetoric and anti-LGBTI groups stem from religious groups that are US-based that are funding these institutions locally, and their ask is not much. Those anti-LGBT religious groups and anti-bodily autonomy or sexual rights groups, when they fund, their funding comes very flexible with the notion of only requesting local CSOs to at least put messaging out that is related to abortion, for instance, that is related to LGBTI people, to steer homophobia and hate speech from a biblical point of view. So the fact remains is the influence will always remain in every African country, irrespective of where we find ourselves. The question is, how strong and how willed are we as sovereign states to advance what we fought for years ago, and that was freedom and equality for all and the rule of law? And if that advancement comes, then it is important for us also to talk about what these basic principles mean for us, because these basic principles stem from quite a high level of the need that states need to protect the LGBTI people from violence. They need to prevent the process of torture or any ill treatment to LGBTI people. They need to advance repealing laws and also prohibit and address any issues that are anti-LGBTI and safeguard the human rights of the LGBTI people. So if you look at it from that context, we will always find politics at play here, and what the state is and what the government is and how it's also seen. If you look at us right now in the African continent, and the manifestation of what I will be sharing comes from Botswana. And this also came from exactly from the African Commission, where the leadership is saying that there's a big difference for us between human rights and people's rights. And when we talk about people's rights, we are connecting it to the voices and majority of what the people want, not the overarching principle of respecting human rights for all. So that initially says, when Festus Mogae even placed it in that way, he initially said, I could not defend you guys. I could not defend the LGBT movement because I was going to lose votes. And imagine, he became a champion of the key population movement in Africa. So that initially tells you that influence shall remain because power, patriarchy, and misogynist behavior that influences how culture is translated and constantly evolving based on how people see it will forever have an influence on how we are being treated as a movement. So for me, I foresee and always will know for a fact that there will also be civil society organizations that will be influenced to be anti-LGBT or anti-abortion or sexual reproductive rights. So from a broad perspective, anti-LGBTI bills will always emerge because of the non-respect of circular states and circular states being aligned to extreme religious or faith groups, and also what that plays out in how people interpret the message of how abnormal we are and unnatural we are, which is not the case, because people carry personas about the LGBTI movement, yet they have not engaged it. So in the last sentence of my engagement on this question is that countries are not immune to interference and influence on legislation, but they can that influence can either be positive or negative. There are really countries like my own country that I've seen progressive legislative reform, but also influence from their constitutional positioning, because they, like Namibia, any internet article 144 of the Constitution talks about international law, and what they mean by that is that international law and regional law that is ratified by Namibia shall become domestic law, as long as this particular law does not infringe within the constitution of the country. That initially says that they would always be influenced legislatively, and you can't develop or draft legislation without doing comparative analysis and case studies from other countries. So influence will always be there, unless we want to redefine what influence means, because there's no African person who wears a T-shirt that is just made from Africa, who wears completely African clothes from Monday to Friday and Sunday to Sunday. So influence is something that we will all need, whether it's in a good way or in a bad way, but the middle edge of that influence is, are we doing the right thing? And and if we are doing the right thing, does it benefit all citizens and the well-being of all people in the different states of representation?
Great thoughts you're sharing with us there, Linda. Thank you so much. And Chanel, I'm just going to throw it directly to you with your final thoughts on the last question about whether a country like South Africa is immune to what we are seeing in Ghana, Uganda, and other places on the African continent.
I agree with Linda, I think 100%. I don't think any country is immune to it. Like, even though in South Africa we're very privileged to have these laws that protect us, that does not make us immune to it. In fact, I think it was at the end of last year, there was a political event. And if you looked at the donor logos at the bottom, one of them was Family Watch International. So they're slowly coming into South Africa as well. Maybe fast, but it's only starting to rise up to the surface now. And I think that this movement has been brewing for a very, very long time. And we just haven't noticed it. But like, the first bubble has kind of popped above the surface, like water that's simmering. And now we're only starting to see it, and it's quite dangerous. It's time for us to organize ourselves. And I think that our time is going to start running out quite soon. And speaking back to Linda's point, I do think as the LGBT movement, we do need to be more organized. We need to strategize together on how we can do civic and religious education for people, but also speaking about how can we occupy political spaces. And that's where it's really important if political parties show that they're open to having LGBT persons, because maybe then we can work to get LGBT folks in the space, and hopefully they do support LGBT rights, since some of them don't. I think what's really important to this is that we all need to have integrity when we're working on this. I think a big thing is that they offer money. They have so much money backing them. And with corruption being so rife throughout Africa, we can see that that's kind of a weak point for a lot of folks, not just politicians, I suppose. So we really need to remain and have this integrity and remember what we are fighting for and working towards. Because at the end of the day, as queer folks, as people in the queer organizations and the queer community, all I think we really have is each other, to help each other out and to stand up for one another, where our brothers and sisters and nibblings on all throughout the continent, where they can't protest and speak out against the government. Us who are in the countries where we can do that, we need to stand up for each other.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate both your insights. And we've come to the end of our 2024 Election What podcast. And Thank you so much to Linda, who's joining us from Namibia, and Chanel, who's joining us from South Africa. And this is a global LGBTIQ plus inclusive democracy and empowerment, or GLIDE initiative, between Outright International Synergia Initiatives for Human Rights and the International Federation for Electoral Systems. Thank you for joining this episode of podcast, and please look out for more episodes like this one throughout the year.